Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Queen Sofia Spanish Institute Translation Prize, Part 2. My name is Patrice Degnan, and I'm the director of the Institute. And today we are honored to have a roundtable discussion following the Translation Prize ceremony done recently, which will consist of 3 reading committee members to decide and explain the reasons why Philip Silver's book, translated from Claudio Rodriguez, Alianza y Condena, Alliance and Condemnation, was selected as the favorite translation among 20 poetry books that were on the short list. Our reading committee consists of 3 scholars, translators, and poets. Lila Sanborn, the committee chair, who is head of creative writing in Spanish and poetry at NYU. Alan Young, the 2018 winner of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute Translation Prize. And last, Leslie Harkema, who is assistant professor at Yale University. Alliance and Condemnation, that was translated by Philip, is a very important scholarly work, taking into account that Claudio is one of the great poets of the 20th century, and it's important that Americans get to know him a little bit more, and of course the mastery of Philip's magnificent translation of his text. Today is a very important day, since this book was among 20 finalists. And I am very happy to hand this over to the Translation Prize Reading Committee. And I thank all of you for your professionalism and for your insight and intellectual abilities to make all of us understand the importance of translation and to keep our mission alive to cultivate translation and literature. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Lila Sanborn. Thank you so much, Patrice, for your introduction and for inviting us to this, to be the jurors of this prize at the Queen Sofia Institute. We want, and I want to congratulate, and I think all the jurors, Philip Silver for winning the Queen Sofia Award for his translation of Alliance and Condemnation by Claudio Rodriguez. The juror, us, chose it unanimously. So it was a real pleasure to discover Rodriguez's work through Silver's translations, the actuality of his poems, so meaningful for these times of uncertainty. I was personally struck immediately by the cadence of the translation, the transmission of a breath, the breath of a poet that conjures alliances and condemnations, not in an either-or situation, but in a juxtaposition of antitheses and contradictions. We should also consider the translations as juxtapositions of the originals, its alliances and condemnations, but mostly by its alliances, because we all know that poetry translations might be condemned by the idea of impossibility. Philip Silver's translations captivated me by its alliances with the rhythm of the poems, harmoniously conveyed, alliances with the flow of sounds which reverberate in alliterations and assonances, alliances with the images, sometimes difficult to translate due to enjambments and grammatical dislocations that the translation respects, rarifying the English language in the same way Rodriguez rarefies Spanish. Alliances with the topics of the poems subsumed by a very particular way of seeing, esa mirada que no tiene dueño, masterly translated as the gaze that no one owns, that has been associated with the mystic poets, imprinting Rodriguez's work with a sense of impersonality, parallel to the task of the translator, of Philip Silver, who has conveyed through his magnificent work the voice of a speaker who searches to transcend through intense attention the nuances of human and nature contemplation.
Thank you, Lila. My name is Alan Young, and I was the winner of the 2018 Queen Sofia Spanish Institute Translation Prize. And it's been an honor to be on this reading committee with both of you. And I wanted to just make a few comments about why we chose the text, why I chose the text, as this really the standout translation of all the books we read. As a translator, reading Philip Silver's version of Alliance and Condemnation, I felt that he really managed to expand my sense of what translation was capable of doing. There's an almost miraculous quality about some of his works in that, some of his versions, in that he seems to do away with the old saws about fidelity versus liberty, or about sacrificing meaning in order to retain some sort of poetic essence. Many of the translations that we read for this prize, which were excellent, were sometimes faithful, workable, but maybe a little stiff. Or they were quite poetic, but far removed from the original Spanish texts. Silver's poems are scrupulously respectful of the originals, and yet he utterly recreates them and makes them his own. You get this, first of all, in the sense of the rhythm of the poems, just reading the English. The poet's meter is quite classical within each line, but somewhat free in this combination. Silver doesn't create English metrical structures, but he creates a lot of echoes through his very fluid use of language. I think one thing that really struck me about this translation is just the amount of creativity he brought to bear on the choice of words. When you're translating from Spanish, it's really easy to rely on the most obvious cognates that offer themselves up as the only solution, the only way of translating a particular word or phrase. Yet, in poem after poem, Silver comes up with really surprising alternatives. For example, in the first line of the poem, A Moment, un momento, he writes, in the Spanish, it's acostumbrados como estamos a los días, hechos a su oscuro aposento, palmo a palmo, ¿a qué nos viene ahora este momento? Now, a very literal version of this might be, accustomed as we are to the days, used to their dark room inch by inch, why does this moment come to us now? Yet in Silver's hands, this becomes so familiar with the days, slowly formed by the contours of their dark chambers, why the gift of this moment now? The word contours is particularly brilliant. It captures the tactile sensation of measuring by hand that lies behind the phrase palmo a palmo, literally span by span. Or in the poem Gestures, the lines, ¿por qué es el mismo el giro del brazo cuando siembra que cuando ciega, el del amor que el del asesinato? In Silver's version, this is, why is the sweep of an arm the same when sewing as when wielding a scythe, or the gestures of love the same as the assassin's? There's a genius at work in making what took a tremendous creative leap look totally natural. Sweep is not an obvious choice for giro, yet it's perfect in this context. Reaping is the more obvious choice for ciega, yet that would lose the secondary meaning of severing or killing. So wielding a scythe is a really inspired choice. So just to sum up, what really struck me about Philip Silver's excellent translation is that in poem after poem, he comes up with just these sorts of brilliant discoveries that make the original Spanish text come alive again in an utterly different way that is at once totally new and totally faithful.
I want to jump in here and affirm what you both have said. I think Lila's phrase, the rarefied Spanish of Rodriguez, is mirrored in the rarefied English of Philip Silver's translation. And I completely agree with what you said, Alan, that there are so many surprises, tiny miracles in the translations that I also found myself in spending a lot of time with the original Spanish. I think that's something that's inherent to Rodriguez's poetry as well. So just a really marvelous experience to read both of these. And I will say, just to expand a bit, I've been going back to these translations in these last few weeks as we prepared these videos, and have thought a lot about the historical context of that moment. Rodriguez writing in the 1960s during Franco's dictatorship, during a time of uncertainty, of oppression, of difficulties that were where no end was in sight. And I found that resonating in unexpected ways with the COVID-19 pandemic. But I've also just been reflecting and thinking a lot more about this book as a collection. And I think that some of the themes that run through it come up in titles. There's a lot of reflection on belonging, what belongs to one, and what does not, what we don't possess. And also there's a lot of reflection about home. So just to bring something to the discussion today, I wanted to read a few lines from the very end of the collection. The collection ends with 2 long poems, which most are shorter throughout, but there's a final poem, long poem called Ode to Hospitality, a homecoming of sorts. And I think that these lines do also reflect exactly what Alan was talking about, the unique choices and the idiomatic character of Philip Silver's translation in English. So this poem has a figure who returns, basically, home. So in the Spanish, it says that this man mira alegremente con esa intimidad de la llaneza que es la única eficacia, los rostros y las cosas, la verdad de su vida recién ganada aquí, entre las paredes de una juventud libre y un hogar sin fronteras. At the end there, between the walls of a free youth and a home without frontiers. I'm translating literally. This is Philip's translation. And he knows, he finally understands, and he looks with joy, with the intimacy of fellowship, the only genuine skill, at the faces and objects, the truth of his life, recovered at last between the 4 walls of an unbound youth and a limitless hearth. And just the slight tweaks from paredes in Spanish to the 4 walls of a room, such an idiomatic phrase in English, brings that translation home in English as well. And that's just a taste from the very end, but I don't think it's a spoiler. I want to invite any viewers to read these beautiful poems.
To highlight the wonderful work that Philip Silver had done, I would like to read one of his translations, and with my Argentinian accent. So, Faded Sunset. The light, excited by conquest, loses confidence now, trembling with impotence. And we wonder if it belongs to the earth or sky. It shrugs off its intimate tenderness and slowly withdraws. What alms given without happiness? What sudden rest does the evening bring? What compassion is there in this faded reddish light? Who spoke to us of the sky's profound pity? Something still remains of the awesome forge of light, but little news of life. A sound, a partly blended smell, the brusque calm of sunset when the fields are far off and the hearth fires even farther, and our defeat from cowardice or arrogance, inertia or glory. Like that of this light, now without justice, rebellion or dawn. It was a great pleasure to work all together, and also with Patrice and the Queen Sofia Institute that offer us the opportunity of reading all these wonderful texts and work together. And also a big thanks to Madi Garza, who has coordinated everything very well for us.
Thank you, Patrice, for organizing this. Thank you, Maddie, for help coordinating our meetings. And thank you, Lila and Leslie, for being such wonderful reading committee members. It's been an honor to be on this panel.
Likewise, it was such a pleasure to read with you and learn from you and make this selection.
Yeah, and it was such a pleasure also, all the different point of views that we have, completely different when all the discussions that we had before. So it was a learning and inspiring experience.
Yeah, it was very
read so much great poetry.
Yeah.